Hey guys, tonight we're venturing into the most dangerous battlefield of all, medieval parenting. Forget dragons, knights, or plagues. The real terror was being raised by someone whose best idea of childcare was don't die in the pig pen. Before we start, take a second to like and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy this kind of thing. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it island. Now dim the lights, put a fan on for that cozy background hum, and get comfortable. Let's pause for a moment. How did parents back then manage without car seats, pediatricians, or even a vague sense of safety? Did toddlers really toddle near open fire pits? How many chores were you expected to do before your teeth even grew in? And what counted as toys in a world where wood was a luxury? Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1352. You're 3 years old. Your pacifier is a stale turnip. And you're already late for work. Congratulations, you're about to be born. And no, this isn't happening in a sterile, softly lit hospital room with doctors who studied for 12 years and a nurse holding your parents' hand. Nope. This is the Middle Ages, where birth is less of a medical event and more of a neighborhood festival. Forget privacy, that concept won't exist for about another 700 years. You enter the world in a one-room house where the walls are so thin the neighbors can hear your first scream before your parents do. Midwives are present, yes, but they're working with linen cloths, prayers, and herbs that may or may not be effective. There are no epidurals, no fetal monitors, not even an encouraging playlist. The soundtrack to your birth is the sound of your mother screaming, a priest muttering Latin, and someone shouting, "Boil more water," which mostly makes everyone feel better without accomplishing much. Birth in medieval Europe was a community affair. Women from the village gathered, partly to help and partly because, honestly, this was the entertainment of the week. Netflix hadn't been invented yet. So childbirth was basically prime-time television. Neighbors dropped by to give advice, pray loudly, or just hover in the background like unpaid extras. If you thought your family overshared photos of your birth on Facebook, imagine 30 people physically watching it happen in real time. And here's the kicker. It was dangerous. For both mother and child, childbirth was a gamble with terrible odds. Infection? Almost guaranteed. Complications? There's no cesarean section, no blood transfusion, and definitely no antibiotics. If things went badly, your family called in the priest to prepare for last rites. Imagine the vibe of your delivery room shifting from push to eternal salvation within minutes. Comforting, right? But when things went well, it was still weird. Babies weren't exactly celebrated with balloons and pink or blue cupcakes. They were seen as fragile, temporary little beings that might or might not make it through the week. Parents sometimes delayed naming newborns until they were sure the baby wasn't going to die immediately. Nothing says welcome to the family like being referred to as that one until you prove your survival skills. The environment didn't help. You were born into a room filled with smoke from the hearth, dirt on the floor, and at least one chicken wandering around like it owned the place. Midwives did what they could. They tied the cord with thread, wiped you down with whatever cloth was handy, and sometimes rubbed you with salt or wine to strengthen your body, which, in practice, meant your first skincare routine was medieval exfoliation with condiments. And remember, superstition ran the show. Parents weren't just worried about disease, they were terrified of demons. That's why charms, amulets, and prayers surrounded newborns. Some believed evil spirits lurked, waiting to snatch an unbaptized baby. So baptism often happened within hours, not as a spiritual ceremony but as a kind of supernatural insurance policy. Welcome to the world, child. Here's some holy water and a lifetime of original sin. Good luck. Through it all, you, the baby, are completely oblivious. You're wrapped in rough linen, placed on straw, and immediately handed over to someone else while your mother recovers, Or, more realistically, prepares to be pregnant again in about a year. Because family planning wasn't a thing. The only plan was have as many kids as possible and hope two survive long enough to plow the field. So your birth wasn't just a beginning, it was a public performance, a dangerous gamble, and the medieval version of a lottery ticket. Your family cheered not because you were cute, but because you were breathing. That alone felt like a miracle, and with that you've survived the very first trial of medieval childhood. Being born at all. So, you've survived birth. Congratulations. The odds weren't exactly in your favor, but here you are, red, screaming, and already the most stressed out person in the room. Now comes your first official introduction to medieval parenting. Swaddling. In theory, swaddling is about safety and comfort. Wrap a baby tightly in cloth, keep them warm, keep them still, and protect them from flailing arms that might smack themselves in the face. It's the kind of logic that makes sense until you realize medieval swaddling wasn't gentle snugness. It was extreme. Imagine being mummified by someone who just learned how to fold laundry, except instead of being laid to rest, you're supposed to nap peacefully. The baby, meaning you, was wrapped so tightly in strips of linen that your arms and legs were bound straight to your sides. Not bent, not tucked, straight. The idea was that it would help your limbs grow straight and strong. Because apparently, the human body needed parental assistance to figure out which way knees bend. Your parents didn't see it as restrictive, they saw it as preventative medicine. Don't want crooked arms? Wrap them until circulation is just a rumor. For hours, sometimes days, you stayed wrapped like this. You couldn't roll over, you couldn't reach your face, you couldn't even wiggle your toes. Babies didn't coo adorably in their swaddles. They looked like extremely annoyed burritos. And yes, sometimes parents literally hung these swaddled infants on pegs or beams in the house, like coats. If you've ever thought your parents left you hanging as a teenager, just know they meant it literally in the Middle Ages. The benefits? Well, swaddled babies were easier to transport. Your mom could sling you over her shoulder while hauling water, feeding chickens, and negotiating with turnips. You weren't a wiggling hazard, you were portable luggage. Medieval multitasking was basically child in one arm, basket of firewood in the other, lice scratching at your scalp the whole time. Of course, there were problems. Modern pediatricians would lose their collective minds over the lack of mobility, airflow, and general human dignity. Babies sometimes developed sores, rashes, or worse. But parents weren't worried about circulation. They were worried about demons. Yes, swaddling also had a spiritual angle. Bound tightly in linen, you were considered protected from evil forces that might slip inside your tiny, fragile body. Because nothing says safe from Satan like being trussed up like a roast chicken. And let's not forget hygiene. Diapers weren't really a thing. Babies were swaddled for hours, without much thought about what might be happening inside those cloths. Spoiler, what was happening was exactly what you think. By the time the bindings were changed, the situation could be described as biohazard. That, of course, meant constant rashes and infections, but remember, bathing was considered suspicious, so don't expect a quick rinse, just another layer of cloth and a prayer. Still, parents swore by it. A swaddled baby was calmer, quieter, and less likely to roll into the fire pit that doubled as central heating. And that last part is important, because medieval houses were small, crowded, and full of hazards. Fires, knives, goats, puddles of sewage. It was basically one giant baby death trap. Swaddling at least kept you in one place while your parents tried to keep you alive. So yes, swaddling was both a parenting tool and a medieval straitjacket. You didn't look adorable. You looked like a hostage in a linen crime scene. But to your parents, you looked safe. And in a world where death was always lurking in the shadows, safe enough was the best anyone could hope for. Congratulations, you've now spent your first weeks of life, trussed up like a side of meat. If you're still breathing, your parents consider it a win. So, You've been born in a room full of strangers and immediately turned into a medieval burrito. What's next on the parenting checklist? Feeding you, of course. Except here in the 14th century, the menu options are limited: breast milk if your mother is able, a wet nurse if your family has money, and if neither of those are working out, congratulations, your first beverage is beer. Yes, beer. Before you get excited, let's be clear, this wasn't the fun kind. You weren't slamming frothy tankards of craft ale while yelling about jousting tournaments. This was small beer, a weak, watered-down brew with barely enough alcohol to register, but just enough to kill off some of the delightful parasites swimming around in medieval water. In other words, it was safer than drinking from the village stream, which doubled as both a sewage system and a fish graveyard. Picture it. You're 6 months old, gums sore from chewing on stale bread crusts, and someone hands you a little cup of warm, slightly sour ale. No bottle, no sippy cup, no BPA-free plastic. Just fermented liquid in a wooden bowl that probably hasn't been washed since last year's harvest. You take a gulp, wrinkle your face, and boom, you've joined medieval pub culture before you can walk. Why beer? Because water would kill you. Literally. Villages dumped waste directly into rivers. Livestock waded into the same streams people drank from. And germs, though invisible, were everywhere. Of course, no one knew what germs were. They just knew that people who drank water tended to die faster than people who drank beer. So, beer became the family beverage. Parents drank it. Kids drank it. Even toddlers were expected to sip it with breakfast porridge. And it wasn't just about hydration. Beer had calories. In a world where food was scarce and famine was always one bad harvest away, every extra calorie counted. A mug of small beer was like a liquid slice of bread, filling, mildly nutritious, and guaranteed not to wriggle with parasites. Parents weren't being reckless. They were being practical. Still, it's hard not to laugh at the thought of a toddler staggering around with foam on their upper lip, ready to fight anyone who tried to take their wooden toy sheep. Of course, small beer wasn't always consistent. Sometimes it was weak enough to be safe. Other times, depending on the brewer's skill or lack thereof, it might come out stronger than expected. Which means, yes, there were probably drunk babies. Imagine your parents rocking you to sleep, only to realize you've passed out face first in your porridge because your safe drink came out closer to an IPA. And let's not forget the hygiene factor. Brewing beer in the Middle Ages was a messy process, fermenting in open vats, stirring with wooden paddles that doubled as farm tools, storing in barrels that might also have been used for fish. The taste? Let's call it earthy. To a baby, though, it was just normal. You didn't know any better. You weren't craving grape juice. You were just trying to survive in a world where hydration was Russian roulette. Parents probably congratulated themselves when you gulped it down without choking. Look at him, strong as an ox already. Meanwhile, you were just tipsy enough to nap through the rest of the day, which made you the ideal medieval baby. Quiet, drowsy, and not currently crawling into the fire pit. So yes, your first drink wasn't milk or formula. It wasn't apple juice or a cartoon-themed juice box. It was beer. Medieval parenting skipped straight past age appropriate and landed firmly in whatever keeps the kid alive another day. And surprisingly, it often worked. Congratulations, you're hydrated, slightly buzzed, and still alive. For now, by now you've been swaddled into a linen burrito and washed it down with a pint-sized mug of medieval beer. Life is strange. And then comes teething. That magical time when your tiny gums ache, your mood sours, and your parents desperately look for ways to keep you from screaming all night in a one-room house where everyone already has insomnia. In our modern world, teething means silicone rings chilled in the freezer, maybe a little baby-safe gel, or at least a brightly colored chew toy. But in the Middle Ages? Forget it. Freezers didn't exist, and the only gel available was pig fat. Parents gave babies the next best thing. Hard objects to gnaw on, bread crusts, leather straps, wooden spoons, and, yes, actual animal bones. Picture this. You're 4 months old, drooling like a leaky bucket, and your father hands you the shin bone from last night's stew. It's still greasy, still smells like goat, and your only thought is, finally, something to chew. To a medieval parent, this made perfect sense. The bone was tough, durable, and free. Also, chewing on bones was considered strengthening. Who needs teething biscuits when you can get your jaw workout from leftover livestock? Of course, hygiene wasn't exactly part of the plan. Bones weren't boiled clean or sterilized. They were just bones. Sometimes charred, sometimes raw. If a dog hadn't already dragged it across the yard, it was considered safe enough for you. And when you were finished, the bone went right back to the floor until the next baby needed it. Sharing wasn't just caring, it was survival. And it wasn't just bones. Hardened bread crusts, so tough they could probably deflect arrows, were also common teething tools. They called it hardtack, but it might as well have been baby's first dental challenge. Babies gummed away at these little chunks until they softened or until a tooth poked through. Imagine the joy of cutting your first tooth while chewing something so hard even the family goat gave up on it. Leather straps were another favorite. Parents would hand you a belt or a spare scrap of cowhide. You'd gnaw on it happily, while your mother spun wool and pretended not to notice that you were technically eating her shoe. And if nothing else was available, wooden spoons. Because nothing says loving care like the same utensil used to stir pottage doubling as your chew toy. Naturally, things sometimes went wrong. Splinters from bones, choking hazards from bread chunks, or infections from gnawing on things that had been sitting in the dirt. But in the medieval mindset, that was just life. Teething wasn't seen as a medical event. It was an inconvenience. If you lived through it, congratulations. If you didn't, well, the priest was always on call. But here's the funny thing. Babies, being babies, didn't mind. You drooled, chewed, and drooled some more. Maybe you fell asleep with a goat bone clutched in your fist, like a medieval pacifier. Parents found it adorable in their own way. Look at him, already chewing bones. He'll be a strong man someday. Which, in context, meant, hopefully, he'll survive long enough to carry firewood. So yes, your first teething toys weren't colorful rings or soft plastic keys. They were bones, bread, leather, and wood. A starter pack for survival, not comfort. And if you're still alive after gumming your way through an animal femur, you've officially leveled up in the medieval parenting handbook. Congratulations, you've cut your first tooth. It's jagged, slightly yellow, and already aching. But hey, you made it. And you didn't choke on the goat bone. That counts as a win. So, you've survived your first tooth by gnawing on a goat bone like some kind of medieval Labrador. Now, your parents would like you to sleep. Simple enough, right? In the 21st century, this means a crib with safety rails, breathable bumpers, and a baby monitor that lets your parents watch you on their phone while they eat takeout in the other room. But in the Middle Ages, sleep meant a cradle, and cradle meant wooden box with questionable engineering. The cradle was usually handmade, often by your father, who, to be fair, was probably better at chopping wood than carpentry. The result was a box-like contraption on rockers, not smooth, ergonomic rockers, more like wobble violently until the baby either calms down or vomits. Your mattress? Straw stuffed in a sack. The same straw that chickens pecked at earlier. Pillows? Too fancy. Blankets? A coarse bit of wool that smelled like wet sheep. It wasn't cozy. It was survival furniture. And the cradle wasn't always in the safest spot. Parents often shoved it right next to the hearth for warmth. which sounds sweet until you realize babies can roll, cradles can tip, and sparks can fly. Some parents literally suspended the cradle from the rafters, swinging you overhead like a medieval chandelier. The theory was simple: the rocking would soothe you to sleep. The reality was that you spent your first months of life dangling above a smoky room filled with livestock and fire hazards. For peasants, space was limited. Cradles weren't in nurseries. They were smack in the middle of the one-room hut where 6 other people also slept. Privacy? Forget it. The dog was probably curled under your cradle. The pig snorted beside it, and your brother was kicking you through the side of the box while he scratched fleas. If you've ever thought your modern childhood lacked personal space, know that medieval babies literally started life in communal bunking arrangements with farm animals. Sometimes the cradle wasn't even used. Parents would swaddle you tightly and stick you in a basket or a wooden trough, the same one that might hold grain during the harvest season. Babies slept where it was convenient, not where it was safe. If you cried, you might be rocked by an older sibling barely tall enough to see over the edge. Imagine a 5-year-old tasked with keeping you alive through the night while also falling asleep mid-rock, sending you tipping sideways like cargo on a stormy ship. And then there were the accidents. Cradles tipped. Cradles broke. Cradles caught fire. Infants rolled onto floors that doubled as family toilets. Parenting was less about creating a safe environment and more about playing the odds. The goal wasn't 0 accidents. The goal was hopefully fewer accidents than last year. Of course, if you were noble, your cradle was fancier. Sometimes carved with little decorations. Maybe even padded with cloth. But don't be fooled. It was still a box, still drafty, and still at risk of tipping over when the maid forgot to wedge it properly. Plus, nobles had more servants, which meant more people potentially forgetting about you. Nothing says luxury like being swaddled in silk, left too close to a torch, and quietly roasting like a Cornish hen. The truth is, cradles weren't about comfort. They were about containment. Babies were dangerous. Left unattended, you could crawl into the fire, roll into the pig pen, or drown in the family's water bucket. Parents needed a place to put you where you couldn't immediately self-destruct, and the cradle was as close as it got to a safety device. So yes, your earliest bed wasn't a crib lined with plush toys and lullabies playing from a nightlight. It was a wooden cage on rockers, a splintery box wedged between the fire and the livestock. And if you survived the night without tipping, burning, or being stepped on by the cow, everyone called it a success. Congratulations, you've slept through your first medieval night. You may smell like smoke, straw, and goat, but you're alive. Which, in this era, is really all that matters. You've survived swaddling, beer, and sleeping in a glorified wooden box. Now you're finally a toddler, barely steady on your legs, still drooling, and already on the payroll. Because in the Middle Ages, childhood didn't come with playdates and naps. It came with chores, lots of them. Forget toddler yoga or Montessori play kitchens. Your parents handed you a stick and said, "Go scare crows out of the field." At 3 years old, with 0 supervision. If you were lucky, your first job was waving your arms at birds. If you weren't, it was carrying water in a bucket larger than your entire torso. Medieval parenting wasn't about nurturing. It was about making sure every living body, no matter how small, contributed something to the household. Your little hands were never empty. You carried firewood, fetched eggs, gathered herbs, or kept the goats from wandering into the neighbor's garden. If your family had livestock, you were on sheep duty before you had all your teeth. Imagine stumbling through a field in oversized wool scraps, desperately trying to look intimidating to a flock that probably had more common sense than you. And let's be clear, there were no child-safe tools. Parents thought nothing of handing a 5-year-old a sharp sickle or a hoe and saying, "Don't cut your leg off and be back before supper." Toddlers balanced on stools to stir pots bubbling with questionable stew, tottered into fields with heavy baskets, and were trusted to watch younger siblings while parents worked. That's right, sometimes toddlers babysat babies, which is exactly as chaotic as it sounds. Accidents were common, but they weren't treated as tragedies. They were treated as statistics. Fell in the pond? Shouldn't have wandered near it. Got burned by the fire? Next time, don't lean so close. Parenting advice wasn't about prevention. It was about resignation. You'd hear things like, "That'll teach him," or "God spared the smart ones," comforting. But here's the thing. Parents weren't being cruel. They genuinely believed that hard work was the only way to survive. Every hand mattered. Childhood wasn't a protected phase of innocence. It was an apprenticeship in not starving to death. You weren't playing house. You were literally keeping the house from collapsing, and don't expect sympathy if you complained. Whining about chores in the Middle Ages earned you a smack, not a sticker chart. Parents didn't say, "Good job," when you finished sweeping the dirt floor. They just said, "Do it again, it's still dirty." Which is ironic, because clean was a concept no medieval hut ever actually achieved. There were, of course, funny moments. A toddler herding geese is never dignified. Chickens have no respect for authority, especially not from someone shorter than a butter churn. Picture a 3-year-old in itchy wool, arms flapping wildly, being chased in circles by an angry rooster. That was daily life. Parenting was less let kids explore their creativity, and more hope they survive the rooster attack. By the age of 6, you were practically an employee. You rose with the sun, worked until dark, and collapsed into your cradle-turned bed, smelling like dirt and onions, and no one praised you for it. It was expected. After all, survival wasn't guaranteed, and the family couldn't afford dead weight. If you were alive, you worked. Period. So yes, medieval toddlers had chores. Real chores. Dangerous chores. The kind that would have modern parenting blogs calling for emergency legislation. No soft play centers, no brightly colored toys, no snack breaks every 20 minutes. Just mud, livestock, and a never-ending to-do list. Congratulations, you're 3 years old, already gainfully employed, and on track to develop arthritis by 12. Welcome to medieval childhood. So, you're a medieval toddler. You've got chores, you've got bones for teething toys, and you've got beer in your belly. Now comes the other half of parenting, discipline. And in the Middle Ages, discipline was simple. It wasn't about talking it out, reflecting on your feelings, or losing your iPad privileges. No, discipline in medieval Europe came in one universally understood format: hitting. Corporal punishment wasn't just common, it was expected. It was practically a love language. Parents believed that a good beating built character, and by character, they meant obedience. Spare the rod, spoil the child wasn't a suggestion. It was the family motto. What counted as misbehavior? Basically everything. Forgot to bring the firewood? Smack. Said something cheeky to your father? Smack. Accidentally let the goats eat the neighbor's cabbage patch? That's not just a smack. That's a full belt situation. Even crying too loudly could earn you a slap. Because in a one-room house with 8 people and 1 cranky chicken, no one wanted to hear whining. And this wasn't just at home. Discipline followed you everywhere. At church, priests encouraged parents to correct their children with a firm hand. At school, if you were lucky enough to attend, a teacher's stick was basically the medieval version of a red pen. Forget your prayers? Whack. Misspelled a Latin word? Whack. Fell asleep during scripture reading? Double whack. The tools of discipline were endless. Rods, belts, switches, cut fresh from the tree outside. Nature was the medieval equivalent of a parenting aisle. Parents didn't need gadgets. They just grabbed whatever was nearby and applied it liberally. Some even carried sticks specifically for correction, like early prototypes of on-the-go parenting. Of course, parents didn't see this as cruelty. They saw it as survival. The world was harsh, and obedience could mean the difference between life and death. If a child learned quickly not to wander too close to the fire after one smack, that was considered better than letting them learn the hard way by catching fire. A bruise today meant you lived to fetch turnips tomorrow, but there was also enthusiasm. Some parents leaned into discipline as if it were a competitive sport. Chronic misbehavior wasn't met with timeouts or therapy, it was met with escalation. A scolding, followed by a whipping, followed by a public display of humiliation, often with the whole village clapping along like it was open mic night at the stocks. Imagine your tantrum ending with you literally tied to a post for lesson learning. And yet, kids were still kids. They pushed boundaries. They stole apples. They fought siblings. They shouted in church. And every time, parents doubled down on the rod. To the medieval mind, a child's soul was fragile and sinful. Beatings weren't just physical corrections, they were spiritual ones. A good smack wasn't just about stopping you from stealing bread, it was about saving you from eternal damnation. Talk about pressure. Did it work? Well, kind of. Kids certainly grew up obedient or at least very sneaky. The real lesson wasn't don't do it. The real lesson was don't get caught. Medieval childhood was basically stealth training. You didn't avoid trouble, you avoided witnesses. Looking back, it sounds brutal, and it was. But remember, this was a world where life expectancy hovered around 35. Famine was always looming, and wolves roamed the woods. Parents didn't have the luxury of gentle parenting. They had the luxury of survival, if they were lucky. So yes, discipline in the Middle Ages was a smack, a rod, a belt, or worse. No star charts, no grounding, no use your words. Just swift medieval justice applied directly to the backside. And if you survived childhood without permanent limps or a phobia of tree branches, you were probably considered well-adjusted. Congratulations. You've just been disciplined the medieval way. And by disciplined, I mean smacked with something vaguely wooden until you stopped crying. In modern parenting, one of the first lessons kids get is stranger danger. Don't talk to weird adults. Don't get in strange carriages. Don't take candy from people lurking in alleys. But in the Middle Ages, forget it. Stranger danger wasn't just ignored. It was practically encouraged. From the moment you could walk without face planting into a mud puddle, you were free range. Parents didn't hover. They didn't trail behind with snacks and hand sanitizer. They shoved you out the door and trusted that you'd either come back at dusk or be eaten by something large and furry. Either way, dinner was happening at 6. Medieval villages were small, cramped, and filled with people who all knew each other's business. So parents assumed you'd be fine. Sure, there were drunkards, wandering mercenaries, and traveling salesmen with dubious morals. But hey, everyone was part of the community. If you didn't recognize the man walking down the road, your mother probably just told you to follow him and carry his bag. Stranger? No. Temporary employer, and the world outside your hut wasn't exactly safe. Roads were crawling with beggars, thieves, and the occasional outlaw. Wild animals were always lurking at the edges of fields. Wolves weren't fairy tale villains. They were Tuesday problems. But children still roamed. Alone. Sometimes for miles. Toddlers were sent to collect kindling from the woods, and if they ran into a stranger along the way, well, maybe they got directions, or maybe they got kidnapped. Parents shrugged and called it God's will. City kids weren't better off. Town streets doubled as open sewers, filled with market stalls, rats, and an endless parade of strangers. You toddled through crowds of merchants, shouting in 10 different languages, pickpockets tugging at purses, and butchers casually waving bloody knives. Did anyone think, Maybe the toddler shouldn't be here. Of course not. That toddler was probably running errands. And don't think parents gave you rules like never take food from strangers. In a famine year, if someone handed you a scrap of bread, you took it and said, "Thank you." Suspicion didn't come from being offered food. Suspicion came from someone refusing to share it. Sharing was survival, even if the stranger handing you that hunk of meat looked like they hadn't bathed since last harvest. Travel made things even wilder. Families often sent children as young as 7 on journeys to other towns to work as apprentices or servants. Alone. No maps, no phones, no call me when you get there. Just head west until you hit the abbey. And don't forget to bow to monks. Stranger danger? These kids were literally handed to strangers and told, "He's yours now." Even church wasn't a safe haven. Priests, monks, and nuns were often trusted with children, but not all of them were trustworthy. Tales of abuse weren't whispered, they were accepted as part of life. Parents knew, but what choice did they have? Education, food, or protection came through the church. So if that meant letting your kid wander into a cloister full of strangers, so be it. From a modern perspective, it's unthinkable. We imagine helicopter parents tracking their kids on GPS, while medieval parents were basically the opposite. Go play with that mysterious man by the ditch. He says he's a traveling minstrel, maybe he'll teach you a song. And yet, somehow, children survived. Not all of them, of course, but enough. Kids learned to navigate danger quickly. They became street smart before they had permanent teeth. They didn't just avoid strangers. They learned to charm them, work for them, or, if necessary, run from them. Childhood was less about innocence and more about field training. So yes, medieval parenting didn't involve warnings about strangers. It involved tossing kids into a world full of them and hoping they developed survival instincts fast. Congratulations, you're 5 years old, you've made friends with a wolf, and your best babysitter is a man whose name no one bothered to ask. You've survived strangers, wolves, and open sewers. But now comes your biggest threat of all, your siblings. Yes, those adorable little bundles of joy who share your straw mattress and eat your portion of turnip stew. In the Middle Ages, sibling rivalry wasn't just about fighting over toys. It was about survival, inheritance, and occasionally, straight-up betrayal. First, let's talk numbers. Medieval families had a lot of kids. Why? Because most of them didn't survive childhood. Parents treated children like arrows in a quiver. Shoot enough of them out into the world, and maybe 1 or 2 would hit the target of adulthood. That meant if you had siblings, you had a lot of them. Brothers, sisters, half-siblings, cousins living in the house. It was less family unit and more low-budget boarding school. And of course, resources were limited. Food, clothing, attention, everything was scarce. So you and your siblings were constantly in competition. Who got the biggest chunk of bread? Who got to sit closer to the fire? Who got the least flea-infested blanket? These weren't minor squabbles. These were battles of strategy. Forget Fortnite. This was the original survival game, played with spoons and stale cheese. For peasant kids, the rivalry was over survival resources. But for noble kids, it was even more cutthroat. Inheritance laws often meant the eldest son got everything. The land, the titles, the castles. The younger siblings? Tough luck. You were sent to the monastery, married off for political leverage, or shoved into someone else's army. That's right. If you were the second born, your whole life might be spare heir or none. So while modern siblings fight over the TV remote, medieval siblings fought over who got to keep the family's entire existence. And let's not forget the sheer physical chaos. Remember, discipline was a stick, not a stern talking to. Parents didn't step in when siblings fought. If you punched your brother, your mother might sigh and say, "Hit him harder next time." Sibling rivalries weren't resolved. They were encouraged. The logic was simple. Fighting built toughness, and toughness kept you alive. If you survived your sister's bite, maybe you'd survive the plague. Sometimes the rivalry had deadly consequences. If food ran short, siblings were literally competing for calories. If work needed doing, the weaker child might conveniently disappear from the rotation. And among nobles, rivalries escalated to poisonings, stabbings, and betrayals worthy of Shakespeare. Only Shakespeare hadn't been born yet, so no one wrote down your family drama. Even games weren't safe. Wrestling in the mud? Someone lost a tooth. Playing with sticks? Someone got an eye poked out. Sharing chores? Someone got blamed when the goat wandered off. Every activity had a winner and a loser. And in a world without therapy, losers grew up to be very bitter adults. But here's the strange part. Siblings were also your only allies. You slept side by side, worked together in the fields, and relied on each other when wolves or bullies came around. You could punch your brother in the face at breakfast and still fight alongside him against a neighbor's geese at lunch. Love and hate weren't opposites, they were roommates. So yes, sibling rivalry in the Middle Ages was constant, messy, and occasionally life-threatening. There were no tiebreakers, no mom said share. There was only survival of the loudest, strongest, or luckiest. And if you made it to adulthood with most of your siblings still alive, congratulations, you'd just completed the medieval version of a family reality show, complete with betrayal, drama, and maybe a few missing teeth. Congratulations, you've survived your siblings. Barely. Now try to keep that same energy when you all have to share one bowl of soup tonight. You've survived the battle royale that is medieval sibling rivalry. Now, you might think, surely there's some relief, some moment of joy in this grey, mud-soaked childhood. Maybe toys? After all, kids need fun, right? Well, yes, but medieval toys were less fun and more tetanus waiting to happen. Let's start with the basics. Sticks and rocks. Those weren't just toys, they were the toys. You picked up a stick, waved it around, and boom, you were a knight. Or a wizard. Or a kid who just accidentally hit his brother in the face and is now running for his life. Rocks, meanwhile, doubled as balls, marbles, and occasionally weapons. Imagine handing a modern 5-year-old a rock and saying, "Play responsibly." That was medieval parenting in a nutshell. If you were lucky, someone carved you a doll out of wood. Sounds sweet. Until you realize medieval carpentry wasn't exactly precise. Dolls often looked less like babies and more like nightmare fuel. Splintery, misshapen figures with blank stares and jagged limbs. They were treasured, of course, because what else did you have? But let's be honest. If you woke up at night and saw one of those dolls staring at you from the straw pile, you'd need holy water. Other toys were just repurposed household junk. Broken pots became drums. Animal bones became whistles. Buttons or stones tied to string became spinning tops. Kids made do with whatever scraps they found lying around. Did it cut their fingers? Probably. Did it give them tetanus? Possibly. But it also kept them busy long enough for their parents to plough the field without interruption. For noble children, the toy situation was slightly better, but only slightly. They had hobby horses, miniature swords, and balls stuffed with rags or leather. The problem? They were still medieval toys. Hobby horses splintered, wooden swords broke teeth, balls landed in open sewers, and if you were really unlucky, your fun came with sharp edges and iron nails. Picture a teddy bear, but made of wood and vaguely cursed. Games often doubled as violence training. Boys played mock battles with sticks, learning to swing at each other's heads like tiny gladiators. Girls played with dolls, practicing how to wrap them, feed them, and eventually marry them off. That was the real point of toys, not fun, but rehearsal. Childhood wasn't about pretending, it was about preparing. And outdoor games? Rough. Tag often ended with someone face-planting in mud or sewage. Wrestling, was basically a contact sport with no rules. Even ball games were brutal. Imagine dozens of kids kicking a pig's bladder stuffed with straw down a muddy street, tripping, punching, biting, and occasionally knocking over a bystander carrying a basket of bread. That wasn't a holiday event, it was Tuesday. Of course, accidents happened. Kids broke bones, cut themselves, or got infections from their toys. But parents didn't panic. They shrugged, slapped some herbs on it, and called it character building. A scar was just proof you'd had a childhood. And here's the kicker. Despite the danger, kids loved their toys. A splintery doll, a ragged ball, a stick. It was all they needed to escape. Just for a few minutes. From the grind of chores, hunger, and lice. Even in a world of filth and fear, a child with a stick could still be a knight in shining armor, if only in their imagination. So yes, medieval toys were splintery, sharp, and occasionally terrifying. They weren't safe. They weren't cute. They were survival tools disguised as fun. And if you survived playtime without losing an eye, you were doing great. Congratulations, you've just enjoyed your first medieval toy. And by enjoyed, I mean you're bleeding slightly, and your doll is watching you sleep. Sweet dreams. So, you've survived playtime with splintery dolls and pig bladder soccer balls. But what happens when your parents need a break? In the modern world, that might mean daycare, a babysitter, or sticking you in front of a cartoon for 30 minutes. In the Middle Ages, though, parents had a different option, the church. Yes, the local priest, monk, or nun was often your part-time babysitter. And to be clear, they weren't exactly trained in child development. There were no degrees in early childhood education, no colorful classrooms with alphabet posters, no nap time schedules. Instead, you got Latin prayers, stern glares, and maybe a wooden ruler across the knuckles if you asked too many questions. If your parents were peasants, sending you to the church wasn't about learning, it was about survival. The priest kept an eye on you while your family worked in the fields, which meant you were less likely to wander into the pigsty or drown in a water trough. In exchange, you got a crash course in memorizing prayers, standing still for long stretches, and absorbing the constant threat of eternal damnation. Because nothing soothes a fussy toddler like being told about hellfire, church life was immersive. From a very young age, you were expected to kneel, cross yourself, and repeat words you didn't understand. Imagine being 5 years old and already rehearsing for Judgment Day. Instead of storybooks, your bedtime stories came from sermons about saints being boiled alive, martyrs being burned, and sinners being swallowed by demons. Sleep well, little one, and if you were slightly older, congratulations, you were now useful to the church. Boys might serve as altar assistants, carrying candles or ringing bells. Girls might help with cleaning, sewing, or singing hymns in choir. This wasn't volunteering. It was unpaid child labor disguised as holiness. Medieval parents loved it, because it meant free childcare with a side of moral education. Of course, the church also served as a pipeline. If you were obedient and had a good memory, you might be sent into monastic life permanently. Imagine being 7 years old, dropped off at an abbey, and suddenly your whole future is chanting, gardening, and celibacy. Your parents didn't call it abandonment, they called it securing your eternal soul. Conveniently, it also reduced the number of mouths to feed at home, and while priests and monks weren't exactly playful, they did give you structure. You learned discipline, order, and the importance of silence, valuable skills in a crowded village where noise was constant. Did it make you happy? Not necessarily. Did it keep you alive until adulthood? Sometimes. That's not to say it was all grim. Children did find ways to have fun around the church. You played games in the churchyard, chased each other between gravestones, and sometimes borrowed communion bread when no one was looking. And despite the fire and brimstone atmosphere, monks occasionally told funny stories or shared a bit of honeymead, softening the experience just enough to keep you from running away. Still, the church wasn't your cozy babysitter. It wasn't there to entertain you, cuddle you, or give you snacks shaped like dinosaurs. It was there to keep you alive, teach you obedience, and make sure you were terrified enough of hell to behave at home. Parents thought of it as outsourcing, you thought of it as boot camp. So yes, medieval childcare was often the priest, the monk, or the nun, and instead of lullabies, you got Gregorian chants. Instead of Disney, you got stories about damnation. Instead of nap time, you got confession. Congratulations, you've just been babysat by the church. You're alive, technically educated, and already terrified of eternal fire. So, you've been babysat by monks, terrified into behaving, and maybe learned your first Latin prayer before you could pronounce your own name. Now your parents are asking the big question: should you be educated or just put straight to work? And in the Middle Ages, education and exploitation were basically synonyms. If you were born into a noble family, congratulations. Your chances of receiving an education went up considerably. Tutors were hired, not because your parents wanted you to reach your potential, but because they wanted you to inherit land without embarrassing yourself by signing the wrong deed. Your curriculum was strict. Reading, writing, arithmetic, Latin, and, if you were a boy, swordsmanship. You weren't being raised to be well-rounded. You were being trained like a particularly expensive piece of livestock destined to run the estate. Girls of noble birth, however, didn't get Latin lessons unless they were very lucky or very unfortunate, in the sense that someone thought a convent might be their future. Instead, you learned embroidery, house management, and how to smile politely through negotiations where your father tried to trade you for a goat, 2 pigs, and political favor. If you picked up reading along the way, fine, but your main exam was marriage, and failing it wasn't an option. Now, if you were a peasant child, things looked different. Education was rare, unless you count learning how to dig turnips faster. For most kids, school meant chores. Your father taught you how to swing a sickle without cutting off your leg. Your mother taught you how to bake bread that didn't kill people. This was hands-on learning in the most literal sense, and if you couldn't keep up, well, there were always younger siblings waiting to replace you. Formal schooling for peasants did exist in some towns, usually run by the church. But don't imagine cheerful classrooms with quills and neatly lined parchment. Picture one room, freezing cold, filled with children chanting prayers under the watchful eye of a priest with a stick. Forget multiplication tables, you memorized psalms. Forget finger painting, you practiced kneeling until your knees went numb. And if you slipped up, whack. Education was less about enlightenment and more about discipline. Even apprenticeships, which sound like an opportunity, were just exploitation with a fancy title. At age 7 or 8, your parents might hand you over to a blacksmith, weaver, or tanner to learn a trade. What this meant in practice was, congratulations, you're now free labor. You swept floors, fetched tools, stoked fires, and occasionally learned a skill if your master remembered you existed. Apprenticeships could last 7 years or more, during which you were paid in food, lodging, and maybe the occasional scrap of clothing. Minimum wage didn't exist. Minimum survival did. For many kids, this was the real education. Learning obedience, endurance, and how to stay alive while doing dangerous tasks with zero training. Did you burn yourself at the forge? That was your lesson. Did you breathe in toxic fumes while tanning hides? Congratulations. You just discovered chemistry the hard way. And if you complained, your master reminded you that your parents literally paid him to take you in. So you had better get back to work. So yes, education in the Middle Ages wasn't about unlocking your potential. It was about slotting you into your assigned role: priest, peasant, soldier, or wife. If you happened to pick up literacy along the way, good for you. If not, you still knew how to chase chickens, swing a stick, and pray you didn't starve. Congratulations, you're now officially educated, which in medieval terms means you can recite a psalm while carrying a bucket of water twice your body weight. Truly, a well-rounded childhood. You've worked in the fields, you've fetched water, and maybe you've even survived your first apprenticeship without losing a finger. Surely now it's time to relax. Time for some good old-fashioned play. Except, remember, this is the Middle Ages. Playdates weren't happening in sanitized indoor gyms with juice boxes and safety mats. They were happening in muddy streets filled with rats, sewage, and the occasional corpse. Let's set the scene. You and the neighborhood kids gather in the town square. The ground is slick with animal droppings, a puddle of something unidentifiable, and a faint smell of fish from the market stall that hasn't been cleaned since last Lent. But you don't care. You're a child, and you're ready for fun. And fun means games like tag, wrestling, and pig's bladder ball. Yes, pig's bladder ball. Exactly what it sounds like. You blow up an actual pig's bladder, tie it shut, and kick it around until it bursts. Congratulations, you just invented soccer, but smellier. Other games were equally questionable. You might toss bones like dice, play mock sword fights with sticks, or race barefoot across cobblestones sharp enough to double as dental tools. Hide and seek often ended with someone actually getting lost in a neighbor's grain bin. And hopscotch? More like jump over the open sewer trench and try not to fall in. Of course, injuries were common. Broken noses, scraped knees, and missing teeth were considered part of the fun. Parents didn't hover, shouting, "Be careful!" They barely noticed. As long as you stumbled home in one piece, well, one mostly complete piece, they considered it a successful day of recreation. And then there was the constant backdrop, pestilence. The plague loomed over every childhood. Even in non-plague years, fevers, coughs, and mysterious rashes swept through towns like unwelcome house guests. Imagine playing tag with your friends one week and discovering half of them are gone the next. Playdates weren't just dangerous, they were high stakes. Every hug, every shared sip of ale, every tumble in the dirt came with the risk of contracting something fatal. Germ theory didn't exist, but kids understood on some level that touching Timmy might kill you. Still, children found joy. They laughed, they shouted, they played until the sun set. Medieval parents believed that play built strength and resilience. And resilience wasn't optional, it was the only way to survive. Wrestling in the mud wasn't just fun. It was training for the day you might be pressed into military service. Chasing geese across the yard wasn't just entertainment, it was practice for herding livestock without losing your dinner. Childhood games doubled as rehearsals for adulthood, whether you realized it or not. And don't forget the church's influence. Religious leaders frowned on certain kinds of play, especially if they seemed too rowdy or sinful. Dancing, for example, was suspicious. So was gambling with dice. Too much laughter was a warning sign that the devil might be involved. Yet, despite all the frowns and finger-wagging, children kept playing. Because even in a world filled with hunger, filth, and fear, kids did what kids do best. They made fun out of nothing. So yes, your medieval playdate involved mud, rats, pig bladders, and a side of possible plague. There were no safe spaces, no carefully planned activities, no pre-packaged snacks. Just chaos, laughter, and the occasional case of dysentery. And if you survived the day without falling into the open sewer or catching a fatal rash, you were considered lucky. Congratulations, you've just had a medieval playdate. You're muddy, exhausted, and possibly carrying a new disease. But you're smiling, and for now, that's enough. You've had your fun in the mud, kicking around a pig's bladder and dodging the plague. But now it's time to flash that winning medieval smile. Except there isn't one, because in the Middle Ages, your teeth didn't stand a chance. Tooth decay wasn't a possibility. It was a guarantee. First, let's be clear, dental hygiene wasn't really a thing. Toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist. Toothpaste? Forget it. The closest you got was rubbing your teeth with a rag, maybe dipped in ashes or salt, if your parents were feeling fancy. Some people chewed sticks or herbs to freshen their breath, but most people just didn't, which meant that by the time you hit adolescence, your mouth already resembled the ruins of a small castle, crumbling, blackened, and definitely not structurally sound. Children weren't exempt. By the age of 10, you probably had cavities. By 15, you had toothaches, so constant they became part of your personality. Sugar wasn't even common yet. It was an expensive luxury, imported from far away. But you didn't need sugar to rot your teeth. Gritty bread, full of ground-up husks and sometimes actual sand, worked just as well. Every bite of medieval bread was like flossing with gravel. Your enamel never stood a chance. And if you were noble? Ironically, things might have been worse. The wealthy could afford sweet treats, candied fruits, honey, and, occasionally, imported sugar. Nobles showed off their wealth with desserts, and the result was teeth that rotted even faster than the peasants. So yes, even if you grew up in a castle, you were still destined for toothless misery. What happened when a toothache became unbearable? Welcome to medieval dentistry, also known as pain, but louder. There were no dentists as we know them. Instead, you went to the barber surgeon, the same guy who cut your hair, drained your blood, and maybe stitched wounds after a tavern brawl. He would yank your tooth out with pliers, no anesthesia, no antiseptic, and usually no accuracy. If you were lucky, he only pulled the bad tooth. If you weren't, he just grabbed whatever he could and hoped for the best. Of course, infections were common. An abscessed tooth could kill you. Imagine that. You survive famine, plague, and wolves, only to be taken out by a molar. Parents knew this, but there wasn't much they could do. A toothache wasn't a medical condition. It was divine punishment. Or maybe just bad humors. So while you writhed in pain, your family sprinkled herbs on your face, muttered prayers, and eventually dragged you to the barber with a pair of rusty forceps. And let's not forget breath. Halitosis was rampant. Everyone stank, so no one noticed. If you were a medieval kid with rotting teeth, bad breath didn't make you unpopular. It made you normal. Want to whisper secrets to your friend? They were already too distracted by their own mouth rot to care. The funny part? Parents still expected you to eat hard foods, nuts, dried bread, chewy meat. Meals were less about nourishing you and more about challenging your teeth to a duel. And every time you chewed, you lost another battle. So yes, by the time you were an adult, if you even made it that far, you had a mouth full of cavities, missing teeth, and gums that bled at the slightest provocation. Smiling wasn't charming, it was terrifying. And kissing? Well, let's just say romance in the Middle Ages required a very forgiving nose. Congratulations, you're 12 years old, already half toothless, and still gnawing on bread hard enough to break your jaw. Forget braces. Forget whitening strips. Your dental plan is hope you die before your next toothache. So, your teeth are falling out, your breath could knock over a cow, and your parents are looking at you like, well, you're old enough to be useful now. Because in the Middle Ages, childhood didn't last very long. Around the age of 7 or 8, you weren't considered a kid anymore. You were considered free labor. And that's where apprenticeships came in. Or, as modern historians might more accurately label them, legalized childhood theft. Here's how it worked. Your parents, already juggling 12 other children, realized they couldn't feed you forever. So they made a deal. They sent you off to live with a craftsman, a blacksmith, weaver, tanner, baker, anyone who would take you. And in exchange, you got food, shelter, and the vague promise of learning a trade. Sounds nice, right? Except it wasn't really about education. It was about you becoming the family Roomba for someone else's household. Your daily routine? Wake up at dawn, sweep the workshop, fetch firewood, haul water, stoke the forge, run errands, scrub pots, feed the chickens, and, if there was time left over, actually learn something about the craft. You were promised training, but most of the time, you were just an unpaid intern with worse hours. Think of it as the medieval version of working at Starbucks, except instead of free coffee, you got free beatings. Apprenticeships lasted years, sometimes 7, sometimes longer. During this time, you had no real pay, no weekends off, and absolutely no parental oversight. Once you were handed over, you belonged to your master. If he was kind, maybe you ate well and learned to hammer nails without losing a finger. If he wasn't, you got yelled at, slapped, or worse. And guess what? Your parents couldn't intervene. You were under contract. Childhood officially ended the moment your father signed you away for the price of a handshake. And it wasn't just about work. You also lived with your master's family, which meant you were basically adopted, but not in the warm, fuzzy sense. More in the we own you until further notice sense. You ate what they ate, slept where they put you, and obeyed without question. Did they treat you like one of their own kids? Sometimes. But more often, you were the extra set of hands who fetched water while their real kids played. Of course, there were benefits. If you survived the years of grunt work, you could graduate to journeyman status. That meant you actually got paid for your labor, just not very much. And maybe, one day, if the stars aligned and your master didn't hate you, you could become a full-fledged craftsman. Independence, freedom, your very own workshop. Until then, you were basically locked in a medieval pyramid scheme. For noble children, apprenticeship looked different but wasn't necessarily better. Instead of going to the blacksmith, you were sent off as a page or squire in another noble household. You polished armor, mucked out horses, and served at table until you were old enough to hold a sword without dropping it. Again, this was framed as training for greatness, but in practice, it was years of being bossed around by people richer and meaner than you. So yes, apprenticeship was a path to adulthood, but it wasn't exactly a path of choice. You didn't say, "I want to be a carpenter when I grow up." Your parents said, "You're going to be a carpenter because old man Jeffrey agreed to feed you." Childhood dreams weren't a thing. Childhood itself barely was. Congratulations, you're 8 years old, officially employed, and legally owned by a man with a hammer and questionable dental hygiene. Your childhood has been outsourced. And your new boss is very excited to see how much water you can carry before collapsing. So, you've slaved through an apprenticeship, scrubbed enough floors to qualify as a medieval mop, and maybe even learned how to hammer a nail straight. You're 12, 13, maybe 14. Congratulations. You're now officially considered marriage material. Childhood? Over. Welcome to adulthood, complete with responsibilities you're definitely not ready for. Let's start with the basics. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't about love. Love was a luxury, like hot baths or bread without sawdust in it. Marriage was about alliances, property, and survival. Parents didn't ask, "Do you like him?" They asked, "How many goats does he have?" Your teenage crush didn't matter unless your crush came with a dowry, some land, and maybe a cousin who owed favors. For peasants, marriage arrangements were straightforward. Families bargained over chickens, grain, or maybe a small patch of field. If your father was generous, he might throw in a cow as part of your dowry. Imagine being 14, awkward, and suddenly treated like a human trading card. Your value wasn't measured in personality. It was measured in livestock. For nobles, it was even worse. Your parents might arrange your betrothal when you were still in the cradle. Not exaggerating. Infant engagements were common, locking in alliances years before you could spell your own name. By the time puberty hit, your fate was sealed. You weren't just marrying someone, you were merging family empires. And yes, sometimes that someone was twice your age, or your cousin, or both. Girls usually married younger than boys, often in their early teens. 14 was considered perfectly normal, even ideal, because fertility was everything. Your body might still be figuring out how to grow, but your family expected it to also figure out how to produce heirs immediately. Childbirth at 14 was dangerous, deadly, even, but nobody talked about that. Parents simply said, God's will, while crossing their fingers you survived long enough to produce another heir. Boys married later, often in their late teens or early 20s, once they'd proven they could support a household. That meant if you were a 14-year-old girl, your new husband might be 25 or 30. Romantic, right? Especially when he spent more time talking about crop rotations than about your feelings. The ceremony itself wasn't glamorous either. Forget white dresses, tiered cakes, and first dances. A medieval peasant wedding was often just a simple blessing by a priest, followed by a feast if your family could afford it. The feast might consist of bread, cheese, and ale, and not the good ale either, just the weak stuff you gave to children. But hey, it was a party, and everyone loved an excuse to drink until they forgot how young the bride looked. And for nobles, bigger weddings, sure, but also more pressure. Everyone watched you like a prized horse being sold at auction. Your marriage wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a public transaction. Fail to produce heirs, and you weren't just a disappointment, you were a political liability. Modern parenting books talk about supporting your teenagers' independence, helping them prepare for adulthood at their own pace. Medieval parents? They handed you a spouse and said, good luck. No dating apps, no first crushes, no awkward school dances. Just an arranged marriage, sealed with bread, ale, and the crushing weight of expectation. So yes, by 14 your childhood was over. You weren't finishing middle school, you were starting a family. And while modern parents might freak out if their kid talks about dating at 14, medieval parents were already asking, so, when are the grandchildren arriving? Congratulations, you're 14 years old, married off for a goat and half an acre, and about to learn the joys of medieval adulthood. Spoiler. It's mostly turnips and childbirth. So, you've just been married off at 14, and you're still figuring out how to keep your straw bed from catching fire when suddenly war. Because in the Middle Ages, war was less of a rare event and more of a seasonal activity. And if you were a boy, or sometimes even just tall enough to hold a spear, congratulations. You were about to become a child soldier. Let's start with the recruitment process. Today, there are laws, treaties, and a whole United Nations devoted to preventing kids from fighting wars. Back then, your parents gave you a pat on the back, handed you a stick, and said, "Don't die before supper." Lords needed men to fight, and men often included anyone over the age of 12 who could march without collapsing. 14 was practically veteran age. Training was minimal. Maybe you'd practice swinging a stick at your brother in the yard. Maybe you'd carried water for the village militia. That was enough. Real training came on the battlefield, where the first lesson was, don't stand in front of the horse. Your armor, if you had any, was whatever scraps you could find. An old helmet, a dented shield, or a thick wool tunic that provided about as much protection as wearing a bath towel into combat. As for weapons, the options were grim. You might get a rusty spear longer than your entire body, or a wooden club, or, if your lord was feeling generous, a second-hand sword with a suspicious bend in it. Archery was another option, but bows were heavy, and arrows were expensive, so chances were you were just handed a sharpened stick and told to make it work. Imagine being 14, barely able to grow a mustache, and suddenly responsible for stabbing armored knights who've been fighting since before you were born. And war wasn't glamorous. Forget the Hollywood idea of shining knights and heroic charges. Medieval battles were mud, blood, and chaos. You trudged through fields that smelled like manure, camped in tents that leaked, and ate rations that made pottage look gourmet. Disease killed more soldiers than swords did. So your real enemy wasn't the opposing army, it was dysentery. Nothing strikes fear into a teenage recruit like the words, "The latrine is full." If you were noble, things looked slightly different. You might become a squire, training under a knight. That meant polishing armor, feeding horses, and watching your master crush enemies while you fetched water. Eventually, you might be allowed to join the fight, charging into battle on horseback. Praying your armor didn't tip you over like a tin can. It sounded glorious until you realized how heavy a sword felt after 30 seconds of use and how hard it was to see through a helmet slit. Parents didn't weep as their teenagers marched off to war. They expected it. For noble families, it was honor. For peasants, it was obligation. If your lord called, you answered, or risked punishment. There was no "sorry, my son's too young." Childhood ended the moment your name was on the list. And the worst part? Even if you survived, you weren't necessarily a hero. You were just another body in the field, another pawn in a game where kings and lords fought over land you'd never even step foot on. The reward for living through a battle was usually another battle. So yes, medieval parenting sometimes meant sending your teenager off to war, fully aware he had more acne than training and more fleas than armor. It wasn't considered cruel, it was considered normal. Congratulations, you're 14, armed with a stick, standing in a muddy field, and already questioning all your life choices. Welcome to the glamorous world of medieval warfare, Child Edition. So, you've been married off at 14, maybe conscripted into a war you don't understand, and you think life can't possibly get worse. And then it does, because medieval parenting had one constant enemy: disease. Childhood wasn't just about chores and turnip stew. It was about playing the world's most terrifying game of roulette, where every spin was a cough, a rash, or a sudden fever. Let's start with the basics. Infant mortality was astronomical. Nearly half of children died before the age of 5. Your parents loved you, sure, but they also knew not to get too attached until you proved you could survive more than 2 winters. That's why many babies weren't even given real names right away. Why name little Johann if he might be dead before Lent? Better to call him the boy until he makes it to toddlerhood. Morbid, but practical. And what were you dying from? Honestly, everything. Smallpox, measles, dysentery, pneumonia, scarlet fever, tuberculosis, the entire medieval plague buffet. Even a small cut could turn into a life-threatening infection, fall in the mud, scrape your knee, and congratulations, you've just booked a one-way trip to the graveyard. The big one, of course, was the plague. Black Death. Bubonic. It swept through villages like a broom of doom, wiping out entire families in days. Parents watched helplessly as children developed fevers, black swellings, and then silence. Imagine being a child, playing pig's bladder ball in the morning, only for half the team to vanish by the week's end. Childhood friendships ended not in arguments, but in funerals, and famine made things worse. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, turning every cold into a catastrophe. Parents did what they could, feeding you broth, covering you in herbs, or praying very loudly, but medicine wasn't medicine yet. Doctors still believed illness came from imbalanced humors, so your treatment might be bloodletting, leeches, or just being told to stop sinning, none of which cured anything unless you count cured of life. Parents tried to protect their kids. Amulets were tied around necks, holy water sprinkled liberally, prayers whispered constantly. Some believed diseases were caused by bad air, so they burned incense or carried posies of herbs under their noses. Cute idea, but not exactly germ theory. It was like fighting a house fire with scented candles. For children, being sick was almost a rite of passage. Everyone had fevers, coughs, or rashes. The question wasn't if, but when. And if you survived, you were often scarred for life, literally. Pockmarks, missing limbs, permanent coughs. Surviving childhood disease was like leveling up in a video game, except the reward was lifelong health problems. And yet, families carried on. Parents grieved, yes, but they also kept having more children. In part because they needed labor, in part because they hoped at least one kid would make it to adulthood. It wasn't heartless. It was survival math. Each child was a gamble, and the odds were stacked against you. So yes, medieval parenting meant raising kids in a world where death hovered constantly, ready to snatch them at any cough or sneeze. Childhood wasn't about playdates and growth milestones. It was about surviving until your body stopped being quite so fragile. Congratulations, you've spun the wheel of medieval disease. This time, you've survived the fever. But don't celebrate yet. There's always another spin waiting. So, you've made it through plague season without keeling over, which is an achievement in itself. But medieval parenting wasn't just about fighting disease. Sometimes, the biggest danger was your own parents. Because when famine hit, when the crops failed, or when winter dragged on too long, families faced impossible choices. And one of those choices was abandonment. Yes, the stuff of fairy tales, Hansel and Gretel left in the woods, wasn't just a story. It was reality. Let's be clear. Parents didn't abandon kids for fun. They weren't twirling mustaches and plotting like cartoon villains. They were desperate. In years of famine, when there simply wasn't enough food, survival meant triage. Fewer mouths meant more chances for the rest of the family, and sometimes that meant sending a child away, or quietly leaving them in a field and praying someone else would take them in. For peasants, this was especially brutal. Harvests failed regularly, thanks to bad weather, pests, or just plain bad luck. Bread was scarce, and what bread there was might be stretched with sawdust or clay. Parents rationed what little they had, often feeding adults who could still work the fields instead of children who couldn't. "We'll feed the ploughman, not the toddler," was grim logic, but logic all the same. Sometimes children were abandoned in towns, left near monasteries or churches, where monks or nuns might take them in. This wasn't always tragic. It sometimes gave kids a chance at survival. Many orphanages were run by religious institutions, where at least you'd get a bowl of soup and a roof over your head. But don't imagine comfort. It was more crowded dorm of coughing children than warm embrace of charity. Other times, abandonment wasn't so organized. Parents might simply leave kids in the woods, hoping they'd find work, stumble upon a sympathetic villager, or, failing that, become part of folklore. Wolves didn't exactly make good foster parents, but in some desperate years, parents figured maybe the forest will sort it out. Harsh, yes, but so was starving together, and it wasn't always permanent. Some parents practiced what we'd now call seasonal abandonment. In lean months, they might send kids to beg in the streets of nearby towns, or to live with relatives. The idea was simple: one less mouth at home until times improved. Sometimes the child returned in spring. Sometimes they didn't. Either way, it bought the family a little more time. For nobles, abandonment wasn't common. But sending children away still happened. A surplus son might be donated to the church. A daughter might be shipped off to a convent. Was it abandonment? Not in the parents' eyes, it was strategy. But from the child's perspective, being dropped at a monastery with a wave and a good luck, kid probably felt suspiciously like being abandoned. And the emotional toll? Enormous. But in a world where death hovered constantly, families hardened themselves. Survival required impossible choices. Parents wept, prayed, and kept going, because there was no other option. You couldn't will food into existence. All you could do was hope the children you kept alive would make it to spring. So yes, fairy tales weren't exaggerating. Medieval abandonment was real. Kids were left in forests, convents, streets, or simply handed off to strangers, all in the name of survival. It wasn't cruelty, it was desperation. But to the child, it didn't matter. The result was the same: loneliness, fear, and the sudden realization that wolves don't share snacks. Congratulations, you've survived famine season, and your parents didn't abandon you this year. But don't get too comfortable. Next winter's only a few months away. So, you've dodged abandonment season, lucky you. But if you were born into a noble family, you had a whole different kind of pressure to deal with. Air pressure, that's right. From the moment you squawked your first cry in your silk-swaddled cradle, your life wasn't just about surviving childhood diseases. It was about carrying the entire weight of your family's fortune, land, and reputation on your tiny, lice-infested shoulders. Let's break it down. Inheritance laws in medieval Europe were clear. Primogeniture. That meant the eldest son got everything: the land, the titles, the castles, the sheep. Your siblings? They got scraps. Maybe a dowry, maybe a job in the church, maybe nothing at all. Which meant if you were the firstborn son, congratulations, you were a walking insurance policy. And if you weren't, well, you were basically medieval backup storage. The pressure started early. Tutors drilled you in Latin, swordsmanship, and estate management while you were still tripping over your own feet. Your father glared at you across the hall, silently judging whether you'd be strong enough to defend the family's land when the neighbors inevitably invaded. Your mother reminded you daily that producing heirs was your sacred duty. You were 12 years old and already carrying the stress levels of a modern CEO, and don't think being the heir was glamorous. Sure, you'd inherit the castle, but you'd also inherit all the enemies that came with it. Neighboring lords who wanted your land, uncles who thought they should have gotten the title, and peasants who were constantly grumpy because, well, they were peasants. Your entire adolescence was one long internship in not losing everything. For second sons, the situation was equally stressful, just in a different way. You weren't the heir, you were the spare, which meant your parents had to find a use for you. Option 1. Send you to the monastery. Option 2. Shove you into the army. Option 3. Marry you off to some minor noblewoman with questionable teeth. None of these options involved you inheriting land. All of them involved you quietly staying out of the way while your older brother enjoyed the castle. And daughters? The pressure was different, but just as heavy. You weren't expected to inherit, but you were expected to marry well. You were a bargaining chip in the great medieval poker game of alliances. Your parents negotiated your hand in marriage like they were selling a prized horse. Love didn't factor into the deal. Dowries did. If your marriage brought wealth or land into the family, you were a success. If it didn't, well, better luck next daughter. The worst part? All of this air pressure happened while you were still technically a child. Modern kids stress about exams. Medieval noble kids stressed about dynastic collapse. You didn't get to mope in your room with music blasting. You got to mope in your hall while your father reminded you that if you failed, your entire bloodline might end. No pressure, son. And for parents, air pressure was just part of the job. They weren't lovingly encouraging your hobbies. They weren't asking what you wanted to be when you grew up. They were reminding you daily, you will be the heir, or you will be nothing. Parenting was less supportive life coach and more terrifying boss who never lets you quit. So yes, air pressure in the Middle Ages was suffocating. Whether you were the firstborn trying not to mess it all up, or the younger sibling doomed to irrelevance, your childhood wasn't about play. It was about preparing for the crushing weight of adulthood before you could even shave. Congratulations. You're 10 years old, already stressed about land rights, and developing ulcers before you know what an ulcer island. Welcome to the noble life. So, you've seen how much pressure falls on the boys. Be the heir, save the land, carry the family name. But what about girls? Well, medieval parenting had a crystal clear strategy for daughters. They were bargaining chips. Useful, valuable, tradable, and definitely not ask for their opinion. From the moment you were born, your parents saw you less as a child and more as an investment. You weren't little Margaret. You were the one we'll marry off for political gain. Your life was measured in dowries, connections, and whether your face was considered pleasing enough to sweeten the deal. Beauty standards were simple: pale skin, soft hands, and a look that said, "Yes, I'll produce heirs quietly and without complaint." If you happened to like reading, singing, or existing independently, too bad. For peasants, the calculation was simpler, but no less transactional. Your marriage prospects revolved around land and livestock. A good dowry might include a cow, some chickens, or a patch of grain field. Your parents weren't sitting around asking if you loved the boy next door. They were asking, "Will his family help us survive the winter?" If yes, congratulations, you're engaged. If not, you'd better start learning embroidery to look more marketable. For nobles, the stakes were higher. You were a chip in the great game of alliances. Marrying you off could secure peace with a rival lord, expand landholdings, or strengthen claims to a title. Your hand was less a romantic proposal and more a business merger, and sometimes you didn't even meet your future husband until the wedding. Surprise! That man twice your age, smelling faintly of onions and horse, that's your husband now. The dowry was the centerpiece of it all. Parents often ruined themselves financially, trying to marry off daughters well. They'd scrape together coin, land, livestock, and clothing to sweeten the deal. The more valuable the package, the better your marital prospects. You weren't walking down the aisle. You were being wheeled into negotiations like a prize chest. And if your dowry wasn't impressive enough, don't worry. The convent always had room for another bride of Christ. And once you were married, your job description was clear: produce children, preferably sons. Lots of them. You weren't valued for your wit, charm, or personality. You were valued for your womb. If you survived childbirth, you were considered a success. If you didn't, well, that's why your parents had 5 more daughters waiting in the wings. Sibling dynamics also played into this. If you had older sisters, they needed to marry first, which meant you were on hold until someone took them off the market. Your family's financial situation could hinge on who married whom. The wrong match could doom everyone. The right match could elevate your entire bloodline. Talk about pressure. And yet, parents loved their daughters in their own way. They believed marriage was their duty to you, the best way to secure your future. Did it feel transactional? Yes. Was it transactional? Absolutely. But in their eyes, better to be a bargaining chip than an unmarried burden eating turnips at home. So yes, medieval parenting treated girls less like children and more like walking contracts. You weren't asked about your dreams. You were told who you'd marry and when. And if you were lucky, your new husband was only mildly terrifying. Congratulations, you're 13 years old, betrothed to a man twice your age, and your dowry includes 3 sheep and a particularly nice set of wooden spoons. True love. You've been married off, or traded for livestock, or shoved into a convent because your dowry wasn't shiny enough. Surely, after all that, you deserve a little fun, right? Just a moment to play, to laugh, to forget about the mud, the lice, and the ever-present smell of boiled cabbage. Well, not so fast. Because in the Middle Ages, fun itself was suspicious. That's right. Play was often treated like a problem, to parents and priests alike. Too much laughter meant mischief. Too much mischief meant sin. And sin, of course, meant eternal damnation. So when kids got too rowdy, the adults stepped in. And by stepped in, I mean they punished you for having fun. Take running games. You and your friends are sprinting through the village, chasing each other around the pigsty, laughing your heads off. A parent notices, frowns, and immediately accuses you of wasting energy that could have been spent hauling water. You've got time to run? Then you've got time to weed the garden. Congratulations. Your game of tag just turned into forced labor. Or maybe you were singing. Children loved songs and rhymes, but the wrong kind of song, too silly, too loud, too joyful, was considered indecent. Adults might drag you by the ear, mutter about the devil making children frivolous, and hand you a bucket of slop as penance. You wanted music? Fine. Enjoy the sweet sound of pigs grunting while you feed them, and don't think roughhousing was any better. Wrestling with your brother? Smack. Throwing pebbles with your friends? Smack. Inventing a fun game involving sticks and chickens? Double smack. Parents believed play distracted children from work and discipline. A distracted child was a disobedient child. And a disobedient child was just one step away from summoning demons, apparently. The church doubled down on this suspicion. Clergy often warned against games of chance, calling dice and cards the devil's playthings. Dancing was risky too, especially if it involved boys and girls within a 3-mile radius of each other. Some festivals allowed for play, but even then, adults hovered, ready to step in if things looked too joyful. Laughter was fine, as long as it reminded you of God. If it didn't, straight to confession. But here's the irony. Adults played too. They gambled, they drank, they wrestled at fairs. They just didn't like it when kids did. For children, the rules were harsher. Play was supposed to prepare you for adulthood. Pretend farming, pretend cooking, pretend baby wrangling, fine. Anything that looked like fun for fun's sake? Suspicious. And the punishments weren't light. At best, your parents gave you extra chores. At worst, you got a smack with the same stick they used for kindling. Imagine a modern parent taking away an iPad because you were having fun without it. That's medieval logic in a nutshell. Yet despite the punishments, kids still found ways to sneak in play. Whispering jokes in church, rolling pebbles when no one was watching, turning every chore into a game. Fun was forbidden fruit, which only made it sweeter. You weren't supposed to laugh at your brother falling face first in the mud, but of course you did. And when your parents punished you for it, you laughed again, quieter this time. So yes, medieval parenting didn't just tolerate suffering, it actively discouraged joy. Play was dangerous, frivolous, and a distraction from the endless grind of survival. And when you indulged, you paid for it, with chores, with smacks, with stern sermons about hell. Congratulations, you've just been punished for laughing too loudly at a goose. Lesson learned. Joy is fine, but only if you can churn butter while doing it. Yes, so, you've been scolded for laughing, smacked for wrestling, and possibly accused of inviting demons by singing too loudly. After a long day of chores, punishments, and surviving questionable pottage, it's finally bedtime. Except in the Middle Ages, bedtime routine didn't mean what it does today. No bubble baths, no bedtime stories, no cozy pajamas. Medieval bedtime was less winding down and more struggling to survive the night. Let's start with the bed itself. If you were a peasant, your bed wasn't a bed, it was a straw-stuffed sack. Sometimes the straw was fresh. More often, it was old, damp, and home to a thriving flea colony. Blankets, scratchy wool that smelled faintly of sheep and smoke, pillows. Don't make me laugh. You got a bundled-up tunic, maybe a folded cloak, and the occasional chicken who decided to roost beside you. Comfort wasn't part of the equation, and you weren't alone. Privacy wasn't a thing. Entire families crammed into the same sleeping space. Parents, children, siblings, sometimes grandparents, all packed together like turnips in a storage pit. Everyone shared warmth, fleas, and germs. Did you want to stretch your legs? Too bad, your brother's feet were already there. Did you want silence? Forget it. Snoring, coughing, farting, and livestock noises were your lullaby. For nobles, things were slightly better, but not by much. You had a wooden bed frame, maybe even a mattress stuffed with feathers if you were very rich. But castles were drafty, cold, and echoing with strange noises. Your luxury bed was often damp, your fire went out in the night, and rats the size of cats scurried across the floor. Even in silk sheets, you weren't exactly cozy. The bedtime routine itself was simple. Collapse. There was no brushing your teeth. You didn't have enough teeth left to bother. No warm bath. Bathing was rare anyway, and usually a communal event, not a nightly ritual. You stripped off whatever layers of wool you'd sweated in all day, rolled into the straw, and prayed you wouldn't wake up covered in lice bites, or not wake up at all. Candles and fires were expensive, so nights were dark, really dark, the kind of dark where you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Children learned quickly to be afraid of the night, because the darkness wasn't just creepy. It was dangerous. Fire hazards were constant. Ghost stories were popular. And of course, everyone believed demons prowled after sundown. Sweet dreams, kid. If your parents did give you a bedtime story, it wasn't Goldilocks or Goodnight Moon. It was tales of saints being roasted alive, sinners being swallowed by hell, or cautionary fables where kids like you disobeyed their parents and promptly died. Relaxing? Not so much. But hey, at least it distracted you from the fleas, and if nature called during the night? Good luck. There were no bathrooms. Maybe a chamber pot, if your family was fancy. Otherwise, it was the corner of the hut or the great outdoors. Either way, you risked tripping over your siblings or running into a wolf. Medieval bedtime was a full contact sport, so yes, the medieval bedtime routine wasn't about winding down with chamomile tea and meditation apps. It was about collapsing into a pile of scratchy straw, trying to ignore your cousin's cough, and hoping your house didn't burn down overnight. Congratulations, you're tucked in, surrounded by fleas, and listening to the soothing soundtrack of pigs snuffling outside the door. Sweet dreams, and don't let the lice bite. So, you've survived another medieval night. Fleas, farting siblings, and maybe a ghost story about sinners being eaten by demons. But here's the catch. Even if you made it through childhood alive, you didn't walk away unscathed. Medieval parenting left scars, some physical, some emotional, all unforgettable. Welcome to the legacy of trauma. First, let's talk about the physical scars. You probably collected injuries the way modern kids collect stickers. Burns from the hearth, scratches from livestock, scars from falling into open ditches. Medical treatment was so primitive that even minor cuts could leave permanent marks. A stubbed toe might turn into gangrene. A toothache might turn into an abscess. Your body wasn't just growing, it was recording the daily accidents of childhood like a medieval scrapbook. Then there were the emotional scars. Parents loved their children, yes, but love in the Middle Ages looked like, I'll feed you if we have food and I'll smack you if you step out of line. Affection was often secondary to discipline and survival. You didn't get told, I'm proud of you. You got told, why did you let the goat eat the turnips again? Modern parenting blogs talk about building self-esteem. Medieval parenting built obedience and fear. Lots of fear. Add to that the constant exposure to death. Siblings died young. Friends disappeared overnight from fever. Parents sometimes reminded you not to get too attached because God's will could snatch anyone at any time. Imagine growing up knowing your playmate might be gone tomorrow, and that everyone expected you to just keep working in the fields like nothing happened. Childhood grief wasn't processed. It was ignored, and let's not forget the pressure. If you were noble, you carried the crushing weight of inheritance, marriage alliances, or political betrayals before you even hit puberty. If you were a peasant, you carried actual buckets of water until your back ached. Either way, childhood was less about freedom and more about preparing to shoulder burdens you didn't choose. Anxiety? Depression? They weren't diagnosed. They were just called life. Of course, superstition added another layer of trauma. Parents truly believed demons lurked in the shadows, waiting to steal disobedient children. Illness was punishment for sin. Laughter was suspicious. Childhood wasn't carefree. It was a constant balancing act between survival and divine judgment. If you coughed too hard, your parents reached for holy water. If you tripped over a chicken, they whispered that the devil made you clumsy. The trauma carried into adulthood. Adults often repeated the same harsh parenting styles, because that's all they knew. If you were beaten as a child, you beat your own children. If you were abandoned during famine, you grew up half expecting to be abandoned again. Generational trauma wasn't a buzzword, it was the default operating system, and yet people endured. Somehow, children still laughed, played, and found joy in scraps of life. A splintery doll, a muddy game, or a rare feast day with music could spark moments of happiness. Even in the middle of trauma, resilience bloomed. Parents may not have expressed affection the way we do now, but they loved fiercely in the only ways they knew, by keeping you alive, no matter how harsh the methods. So yes, the legacy of medieval childhood was trauma, physical scars, emotional burdens, and a lifetime of superstitions. But it was also survival. Every adult who carried those scars forward was proof of resilience in a world that seemed determined to snuff out life at every turn. Congratulations, you've survived your childhood trauma. Sure, you're twitchy around pigs, terrified of laughter, and missing 3 teeth. But you made it, and in the Middle Ages, that was enough. So, you've survived medieval childhood, scars, trauma, lice, and all. But let's take a step back and imagine, what if you dropped a modern parent into the 14th century? What if someone from the year 2025 showed up with a stroller, baby monitor, and a jar of organic pureed carrots? The villagers wouldn't say, "Wow, what a thoughtful parent." They'd say, "Witch. Burn them." Let's start with the stroller. Imagine wheeling your baby around the muddy, rutted streets of a medieval village in a sleek, 4-wheeled contraption with cup holders. The peasants would stare like you'd just rolled out a golden chariot. No sane parent in their world would push a baby around. Babies were carried in arms, strapped to backs, or left swaddled in cradles while you worked. A stroller? That's sorcery on wheels. Straight to the stake, or the baby monitor. You tuck your child into a straw-free, flame-resistant crib, pop on a white noise machine, and then casually walk into the next room, still able to hear every coo and cry. In medieval Europe, that's not technology, it's demonic possession. Voices carrying through thin air? They'd be calling the priest before you could explain Bluetooth. And don't even think about vaccines. You show up at the village with your baby safely protected from smallpox, measles, and plague, and the locals would lose their minds. This child doesn't get sick? Clearly, the devil protects it. The fact that you didn't lose 3 of your children to dysentery by age 5 would be irrefutable proof that you'd made a pact with dark forces. Feeding practices would get you in trouble too. Pulling out a pouch of pre-mashed fruit puree for your toddler? Suspicious. Handing them pasteurized milk? Definitely suspicious. And don't you dare say the phrase gluten-free. Bread was the cornerstone of survival. To medieval ears, refusing bread was like refusing air. Clearly, witchcraft. Modern parenting habits like gentle discipline would also be a red flag. Imagine telling a medieval parent that you don't hit your child, that instead you use timeouts and verbal redirection. They'd laugh for a moment, then glance nervously at your calm, non-bruised child and whisper, "The only way this works is if she's in league with Satan." And bedtime routines? A quiet nursery, a nightlight shaped like a friendly animal, maybe some lullabies playing on your phone. Absolutely not. Night was for darkness, demons, and communal farting under wool blankets. Creating a calm, safe environment for a child to sleep would be so unrecognizable it could only mean sorcery. Even the idea of childhood as a protected phase of innocence would be damning. Medieval people didn't think of children as magical cherubs. They thought of them as tiny adults in training. Seeing a modern parent encouraging creative play instead of handing their toddler a bucket of manure would be grounds for an inquisition. And let's not forget, you'd smell different. Modern parents bathe themselves and their children regularly. Medieval villagers, suspicious of water, would assume your cleanliness was proof of unnatural forces. The child smells of lavender, not onions and sweat. So yes, if modern parenting showed up in the 14th century, it wouldn't be admired. It would be feared. Your stroller, your sippy cups, your soothing bedtime playlists, they'd all be seen as evidence of a deal with the devil. Congratulations, you're a loving, thoughtful, modern parent. And in medieval Europe, that means you're going up in flames at the village square. At least your kid will have the cleanest, safest childhood ever, right before everyone calls it witchcraft. So, we've covered bones for teething, pig bladders for soccer, and the general likelihood of being traded for goats. But here's one of the strangest aspects of medieval parenting. Sometimes, your parents didn't even feed you themselves. Enter the world of the wet nurse economy. For noble families, breastfeeding was often considered beneath them. A lady of high status had important duties, like managing estates, embroidering, or producing even more heirs as quickly as possible. Spending months tied to a nursing infant? Too time-consuming. So, they outsourced the job. They hired another woman, a wet nurse, to handle it. The arrangement was simple. Wealthy parents handed off their baby, and the wet nurse provided milk, comfort, and round-the-clock childcare. In return, she received money, food, or lodging. For many poor women, this was an actual profession, one of the few ways they could make a living. But for the child, it meant your first bond wasn't even with your mother. It was with someone else's mother, probably living in another village, who had her own kids to worry about. Yes, that's right. Many wet nurses continued to feed their own children alongside their noble charges, which meant your noble heir mouth might have been fighting for attention with a peasant baby named Alf. Parents didn't see this as a problem, they saw it as efficiency. Why raise your own child when someone else can do it while you focus on falconry? Of course, there were risks. Some babies bonded more with their wet nurse than with their biological mother, creating awkward dynamics when they were eventually returned home. Imagine being 3 years old, handed back to a mother you barely recognize, while sobbing for the woman who actually fed you. Did medieval parents see this as trauma? Nope. They saw it as practical logistics. And for the wet nurses, the work wasn't easy. They were expected to follow strict rules about diet and behavior to keep their milk pure. Some contracts banned them from eating garlic or onions, drinking too much ale, or even sleeping with their husbands, lest their milk be corrupted. As if medieval milk wasn't already flavored with whatever was in the air that day: smoke, sweat, and sadness. For peasant families, the wet nurse economy looked different. They couldn't afford to hire one, but sometimes desperate situations forced mothers to hand babies off to relatives or neighbors. A mother might die in childbirth, leaving the child dependent on whoever was lactating nearby. The community stepped in where it could, but the reality was harsh. If no milk was available, survival chances plummeted, and nobles didn't stop at wet nurses. Some even sent their children away entirely, to be raised in another household until they were old enough for formal education. Parenting became a kind of long-distance arrangement. You provided the genetic material, someone else did the nurturing, and you reunited years later, hoping the kid turned out vaguely functional. The church, of course, had opinions. Some clergy frowned on nobles shirking their duties, arguing that mothers had a sacred obligation to nurse their children. Others shrugged, and accepted that wet nurses were part of the social order. After all, if nobles didn't outsource, who would employ all these lactating women? So yes, the wet nurse economy was booming in the Middle Ages. It was practical, transactional, and very weird by modern standards. Imagine outsourcing your baby's feeding to someone else, writing a contract about garlic intake, and then bragging that your kid was thriving on imported milk. Congratulations, you've just been nursed by a stranger, bonded with her baby more than your own siblings, and been returned to your parents like a borrowed goat. Medieval outsourcing at its finest. So, we've talked about wet nurses, who outsourced feeding, and now it's time to talk about schooling. Except in the Middle Ages, school usually meant the field outside your hut. For most children, homework wasn't math problems or spelling lists. Homework was herding work. Let's start with the peasants, since they made up most of the population. Your assignments as a child had nothing to do with books. You were told to keep geese out of the grain, to chase goats back into the pen, or to stand in a muddy field flapping your arms at crows like a human scarecrow. Forget multiplication tables. You were learning the multiplication of sheep, and the work started young. By the age of 5 or 6, you were expected to contribute. While noble kids might be learning Latin declensions, you were learning to distinguish which pile of droppings belonged to which animal. Practical, yes. Glamorous, no. The chores weren't optional. Parents didn't ask, "Do you feel up to herding today?" They barked, "Don't let the cow wander into Father Odo's garden again, or you'll regret it." You learned responsibility fast, because failure meant an angry parent, a hungry village, or both. If the geese wandered into the wrong yard, you weren't grounded, you were beaten. If you lost a sheep, you weren't sent to your room, you were sent to find it, no matter how far it had strayed. And herding wasn't safe. Wolves, thieves, and neighboring kids with sticky fingers all posed threats. Imagine being 7 years old, barefoot in the mud, and suddenly realizing you're the only thing standing between your family's survival and a wolf with dinner plans. Homework stress takes on a whole new meaning, but it wasn't just herding. Kids fetched water, chopped kindling, and carried baskets of firewood so heavy they left grooves in your shoulders. Parents saw no difference between child and worker, except children were smaller and complained more. And those complaints were usually met with a smack and the timeless phrase, "When I was your age," which, in medieval terms, probably meant when I was 6 and already working like a 40-year-old. For noble children, homework looked different, but it wasn't easier. Boys practiced sword drills until their arms ached, or learned how to ride horses without falling off. Girls spent hours on embroidery, sewing, and household management. You weren't doing times tables. You were practicing the fine art of not bleeding on expensive fabric when you stabbed yourself with a needle. Even kids who went to actual school weren't off the hook. After memorizing Latin prayers all day, they still had to help with chores at home. A peasant boy might go from chanting psalms to mucking out pigsties within the same hour. Forget after-school snacks. Your after-school activity was carrying water until your spine complained, and parents enforced it with no sympathy. Homework wasn't about developing skills, it was about survival. If you didn't finish your chores, the family suffered. That meant there was no slacking. You couldn't fake your way through it, because the missing firewood or wandering geese told on you louder than any teacher could. So yes, medieval homework wasn't algebra or essay writing. It was herding livestock, carrying buckets, and keeping the family alive. You didn't get graded with gold stars. You got graded with, "Did everyone eat tonight?" And if the answer was yes, then congratulations, you passed. Congratulations, you've just finished your medieval homework. Your arms hurt, your feet are muddy, and the geese hate you. But hey, at least you didn't get eaten by wolves this time. That's an A+. So, you've herded geese, lugged water, and maybe avoided being eaten by wolves. After all that, Surely you've earned a little downtime. But in the Middle Ages, entertainment didn't mean Netflix, TikTok, or even a nice paperback. Entertainment meant sitting around a smoky fire while your parents told you terrifying stories that guaranteed you'd never sleep again. Let's set the scene. The day's work is finally over. The goats are locked in the pen. Hopefully, the bread is baked, questionably, and the house smells of smoke, onions, and general despair. The family gathers by the hearth because it's the only source of light, warmth, and occasional accidental arson. You, the child, curl up on the straw floor, itching from fleas, ready for some fun. And what counts as fun? Stories. Lots of them, but not happy stories, not bedtime rhymes about puppies or gentle tales of adventure. No, medieval storytelling was designed to terrify you into obedience. A favorite? Tales of children who wandered too far into the woods and never came back. Wolves, witches, and demons lurked in every narrative. Another classic? Saints who were tortured in the most creative ways imaginable. Boiled in oil, flayed alive, or roasted on spits. Nothing lulls a child to sleep like imagining themselves as human barbecue. Sometimes the stories were cautionary. Don't lie, or the devil will come for you. Don't skip chores, or the fairies will steal your soul. And my personal favorite, don't whistle at night, or the dead will hear you and drag you away. Sweet dreams, kid. Music was another staple of firelight entertainment. Parents or older siblings might pull out a lute, a fiddle, or just clap along while singing ballads. But these songs weren't cheerful ditties. They were long, droning tales about wars, lost loves, and famine. Imagine trying to relax to a 27-verse ballad about a man who died in a ditch. That was your lullaby. Games sometimes made an appearance too. Children played riddles, guessing games, or simple contests like who could balance a spoon on their nose the longest. But don't picture lively board games or colorful pieces. A medieval board game was often just throwing bones on the floor and making up rules as you went. Dice, of course, were frowned upon by the church because gambling was a sin. But that didn't stop people from sneaking them out after a few mugs of ale. And then there was the fire itself. Children stared into the flames, imagining shapes, whispering jokes, or trying not to cough from the smoke. Fires weren't clean or controlled. They smoked constantly, filling your one-room hut with a haze that stung your eyes. Entertainment by firelight always came with a side of mild suffocation. For noble kids, the firelight setting was fancier, but the themes were the same. They might have troubadours or jesters performing songs and stories, but the tales were still grim, knights dying in battle, lovers separated by fate, saints being martyred in creative ways. You got fancier rhymes, but the nightmares were identical, and yet, despite the horror, children loved it. Storytelling was magical. It was one of the few times families came together not to work or scold, but to share something. Sure, it gave you nightmares, but it also gave you imagination. Around the fire, you dreamed of adventures, faraway lands, and maybe, just maybe, a future where you weren't constantly itchy. So yes, medieval entertainment wasn't cheerful. It was smoky, terrifying, and often depressing. But it was also the glue that held families together on long, dark nights. Congratulations, you've just been lulled to sleep by a 40-verse ballad about famine while choking on wood smoke. Enjoy your nightmares. So, you've been terrified into sleep by firelight stories about saints being flambéed alive. But don't worry, your parents are keeping you safe. How? By consulting omens. Because in the Middle Ages, parenting wasn't guided by science or medicine. It was guided by superstition, paranoia, and the occasional goose acting strangely. Let's start with the basics. Every hiccup, sneeze, or rash you had wasn't just a bodily function, it was a message. A sneeze could mean a demon had just flown out of your nose. A birthmark might mark you as chosen by God or cursed by the devil. A twitchy eye? Clearly a bad omen about the harvest. Medieval parents didn't need pediatricians. They had signs, portents, and Aunt Agnes muttering, "That cough sounds like witchcraft." If you were sick, your parents didn't check your temperature. They checked the alignment of the stars. Was Mars in retrograde? Then, obviously, your rash was a punishment for your father's laziness. If you cried too much at night, it wasn't colic. It was fairies trying to swap you for a changeling. The solution? Leave you outside overnight, or wave iron scissors over your crib. Nothing says safe parenting like placing sharp metal over a baby's head. And omens weren't limited to illness. Everyday parenting decisions were driven by superstition. If a black cat crossed the path while your mother was fetching water, she might turn around and decide it wasn't safe for you to play outside. If a rooster crowed at the wrong time, it meant trouble, and you'd be kept home just in case. If bread baked unevenly, parents assumed the devil had his eye on the household, and you'd better behave. Birth itself was surrounded by omens. Babies born on certain feast days were considered lucky or cursed. If you came into the world with teeth, yes, it happened, your parents might assume you were destined to become a sorcerer. Which sounds cool until you realize medieval villagers didn't exactly like sorcerers. Animals were particularly suspicious. Parents watched dogs, cats, and cows for signs about your future. If a dog barked at you, it was a bad omen. If a cow licked your face, it was good luck, and also a very bad smell. Birds flying overhead were analyzed like they were delivering stock tips. A crow cawing near your window might mean death. A dove meant protection. Either way, your fate was being decided by poultry. And let's not forget dreams. Parents believed dreams were messages from God or the devil. If your mother dreamed of fire, she might assume you were destined for trouble. If she dreamed of water, it might mean baptism was urgent. Children themselves weren't asked about their dreams, of course. You were too busy drooling into your straw mattress. But rest assured, your parents were interpreting your destiny based on whether they dreamed about goats. The funny part? None of these omens actually made you safer. They just made life scarier. Parents stressed about signs constantly, while children got dragged through rituals involving herbs, charms, and prayers. A necklace of garlic to ward off demons. A little pouch of salt tied to your swaddle. Your entire childhood wardrobe doubled as a portable exorcism kit. So yes, medieval parenting wasn't based on logic. It was based on omens, signs, and superstitions. Your survival didn't depend on hygiene or nutrition. It depended on whether your father spotted 3 crows on a fence that morning. Congratulations, you sneezed. Your mother panicked, and now there's a priest standing over you with holy water. Childhood, medieval edition. So, you've survived omens, fleas, and your father waving iron scissors over your crib. But don't get too comfortable, because childhood isn't sticking around. In the Middle Ages, growing up happened fast, like really fast. One day you're gnawing on bread crusts. The next day you're expected to act like a miniature adult with a to-do list longer than your arm. Here's the thing. Medieval society didn't even have the concept of adolescence. You were a child, and then suddenly, poof, you were an adult. No teenage years, no awkward in-between phase where you blast emo music and roll your eyes at your parents. One day you're chasing geese. The next, you're carrying a scythe and worrying about crop yields. Puberty wasn't a milestone, it was the deadline. Clothing was the most obvious sign. There weren't kids' clothes and adults' clothes. Children wore scaled-down versions of adult outfits. By the time you were 7 or 8, you weren't in little tunics anymore. You were in full-length gowns or hose, looking like a tiny tax accountant. Nothing screams fun childhood like being dressed for jury duty before you've lost your baby teeth. And with the clothes came expectations. Parents didn't coo. "Oh, look how grown-up you look," they said. "Finally, now you can work harder." By 10, you were hauling water, tending fields, or helping with weaving. By 12, you were married off or shoved into an apprenticeship. By 14, you were an adult in every sense except, well, you still had acne and a voice that cracked like a broken lute string. There was no space for rebellion. If you stomped your feet and shouted, "I don't want to," you didn't get grounded. You got hit with a stick and told to stop acting like a child. Because technically, you weren't one anymore. Modern teens spend years preparing for adulthood. Medieval kids were just shoved into it, like being pushed into a cold river and told to swim or drown. And let's talk about responsibility. Noble children had to manage estates, learn diplomacy, or train for battle while still figuring out how to shave. Peasant kids had to help keep their families alive, plowing, cooking, sewing, babysitting, herding. There was no finding yourself. You already belonged to someone else's plan. Your family's survival or your lord's ambition. Even fun had a deadline. By the time you were 12 or 13, roughhousing in the mud was frowned upon. Parents and priests expected you to behave with dignity, to show seriousness, to stop acting childish. Imagine being told at 13 that laughter was unseemly and joy was suspicious. Childhood didn't fade away. It was yanked out of your hands. And of course, marriage loomed. By 14, many kids, especially girls, were married or betrothed. Imagine transitioning straight from helping with laundry to raising your own household. The learning curve was brutal, and failure wasn't an option. You weren't a teen, you were a spouse, a worker, a soldier, or a monk. So yes, growing up in the Middle Ages meant skipping all the stages we now take for granted. No awkward high school dances, no first crush drama, no driver's license test. You went straight from dolls and pig bladder soccer to managing children of your own. Usually while still a child yourself. Congratulations, you're 13 years old, wearing an itchy wool gown, carrying a bucket of turnips, and being lectured about responsibility by a man with 3 teeth. You've officially grown up. Fast. And so, you've survived another night in the Middle Ages, or at least, you've survived hearing about it. You've been swaddled like a burrito, handed a bucket as a toy, sent to work before you had molars, and disciplined with whatever stick was closest. Medieval parenting wasn't cruel because parents didn't care. It was cruel because survival itself was cruel. They loved their children in the same way we do now, but love had to compete with famine, plague, and wolves. Lots of wolves. The miracle isn't that so many children died young, it's that any of them lived long enough to complain about their parents later. And yet, through all the harshness, the beatings, the stale bread breakfasts, and the turnip-flavored childhood trauma, people kept going. They grew up. They laughed. They raised more children. And somehow, humanity stumbled forward one pottage bowl at a time. So tonight, as you tuck yourself into a soft bed with sheets that don't itch like sackcloth and no livestock sleeping beside you, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to every medieval parent who managed to keep at least some of their kids alive long enough to pass on the torch. Because without them, you wouldn't be here, scrolling YouTube, wrapped in a weighted blanket, debating if you should finally replace the batteries in your smoke detector. History may be grim and ridiculous, but it's also proof that people are stubborn, hopeful, and endlessly resourceful. Even in an age where childhood was basically free labor with fleas, families managed to carve out joy. So close your eyes now, let the absurdity fade into the background hum of your fan, and drift off knowing that whatever your day was like, at least it didn't involve being handed a scythe at age 5. Sleep well, dream lightly, and I'll see you in the next story.